if you just follow the instructions there about how to use this WAI to pull in some other dependencies. That A11 Wi-Fi or WAI-ARIA file library has a bunch of accessibility, compatibility stuff that deals with differences between browsers for things like some of the ARIA Live stuff you were seeing there, forms, tables, validation, that sort of stuff. So everything that I'm going to do in the presentation is based on those two repos up there. So what I'm going to do first is just walk through some of the common WCAG success criteria that are violated often when people do forms, and specifically dynamic forms. Just walk you through those success criteria. In general, every success criteria in WCAG applies to forms, but there are some that are more relevant than others. I'll just walk you through those. Then I'll go through the fundamentals of form accessibility, and then I'll get into validation. And feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. I don't need to wait till the end for questions. So, as Jared pointed out, there's four kind of areas of WCAG, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Under the perceivable group of success criteria, the things that you see very often are things like WCAG 1.3.1, which is a level A criteria, which is all labels must be programmatically associated with the input field. Then there's, I call it best practice, not strictly part of WCAG itself, but the best practice is to try and closely in proximity and visually associate those labels with their form fields. In particular, that helps out people with screen magnification tools. Then also in 131 is error messages must be associated with the fields. Moving on to 141, don't use color alone. This is typically where things like errors are being displayed. They often, or required fields, sometimes people use color to do that. Color contrast is obviously relevant, in particular if you have things like, Twitter, how many characters left. That tends to be something that's done in a very light color on a light background. So you need to take that into account. In operable category, there's things like making sure that things that appear dynamically, like form level instructions that may appear at the top of the field as you're typing stuff into the field, to make sure that those are announced correctly when they appear in the field. The same thing applies to error messages. If you take action that allows a site mouse user to quickly identify and deal with fields that are in error, then an equivalent mechanism should be provided for keyboard-only users. That's 2.1.1. Make sure that when you're providing keyboard accessibility to your forms, you don't create traps. That can be done inadvertently, as well as by doing things like including flash into the page, which I definitely recommend you don't do. But also, you could do things like add bad keyboard handlers that can lead to keyboard traps, and that's WCAG 2.1.2. Then, continuing under operable. Make sure that the focus order makes sense, that the way somebody looks at the page is also the way the page is encountered by a screen reader user or a keyboard user. Make sure that this user can tell where they are in the form at any point in time. That's 2.4.7. Make sure everything is operable with the keyboard. That applies mostly if you've added some dynamic controls of your own to the form in some way. Then underneath understandable, 3.2.1 is make sure you don't do stupid things when focus changes. I'll show you examples of a lot of the stuff, good and bad. Make sure you don't do things that are difficult for different types of disabilities as people enter input into the fields themselves. It's 3.2.2. Then make sure that you give people ways to prevent errors. This is in particular a WCAG criteria if you have something like tests, if your system is a testing system, or if it's a legal system in some way, a financial transaction system, then you're required to comply with 3.3.4 and then give people ways of dealing with the errors on the pages as well. And then finally, robust, and this relates mostly to making sure that the role of the elements that you're interacting is the correct role, that the name of them is there when it needs to be there, and the value of the state makes sense. And I went through that pretty quickly, but these slides will be available, and I'll go through a lot of those things in much more detail. So starting off with simple labels, there's multiple ways to do labels, and what I've done here is try to point them out in order of preference. The first way to do label association with the input field programmatically, and so I think it was Jared who talked about this, where you could look at a form, and the form could look like the label is associated with the input field visually, but underneath the covers, the screen reader is not able to uniquely identify the two and speak out the label when the user's focus goes into the input field. So the for attribute points to the ID of the input. You'll often see people misuse this by pointing it to the name attribute. That doesn't work, it has to be the ID attribute. But this is the best way to do it because it'll work with the widest range of assistive technologies and the widest number of browsers, and there's no kind of quirks with it. Second best way to do that is ARIA label by, and this is where the association works the other way around, where the input element says my label is and points to the ID of the label element. Now this doesn't have to be a label element, as with the rest of ARIA, it could be any element. But this will speak out correctly, not in all of the assistive technologies, and so this won't be as good for all users of voice recognition software. So certainly try to use the ID association first. Then label wrapping can be used, where you wrap the label around the input element. That can be useful if you have labels that are broken up to before and after the input element. You could use label by to point to multiple elements, but it's a lot easier to just wrap the entire input element with all the text before and after it in a label. The problem with this is it's quirky, and in VoiceOver, for example, sometimes it just doesn't work, or sometimes in screen readers it will read out the label twice. So it's not, the usability of it is not as good, and I would recommend rather using ARIA label by to point to two different input fields if you have that scenario. Let me give you some examples of what these look like in screen reader if you've done them correctly. So turn the screen reader on. So you heard it say first name, edit, text, has keyboard focus. And then as I tab through, middle initial, edit text, it reads out the label and then the text, last name, edit text. So those are some simple examples. The code for those is also relatively simple. So if you look at the code for those, it's basically just, the first two I'm using the for ID association, and then the last one I'm using the ARIA label by, and the label by is pointing to the ID of the label. And I didn't show an example of the wrapping because on VoiceOver it's actually kind of buggy, so that's why I didn't show that example. Moving on. The other example that you will see of simple labels is to use the ARIA label attribute as pointed out by Joseph, or the title attribute. I recommend, this is something that is a valid use case, but there are some quirks that you have to be aware of. So first of all, it doesn't work for sighted users as a label replacement, so you need to have some kind of cited a label in there for sighted users. So the example I'm showing here is quite a common one where the label for the input field is actually the button itself. It says search. You can also add things in HTML5 like placeholders, but make sure that if you use the title attribute that there is a visual label there for sighted users. And if you've done that, or then a valid way to do this, I would prefer the title just because of a wider screen reader support than ARIA label, but or wider AT support in general. Use the title then for the screen reader to make them aware of that, so they don't have to go through the entire form to get to the search and then come back to the input field. If they don't go past it, they know which field they're working with. So let me show you an example of that. read out search text field, search. So because I have the title and the placeholder, you know, it's reading out multiple times, but I'd rather have something read out multiple times than not read out at all. So that's that example. Looking at the source code. Once again, it's the exact same text. So here we have the input field, ID equals search, placeholder equals search. Where's my scroll bar? Title equals search, and then the search button is the visible label. Alright, so that's kind of the most simple thing, but it's interesting how many times people will actually get that wrong, even though it's a relatively simple thing to do. And the tools, you know, whether it's Wave or whether it's our own tool, FireEyes, are very good at detecting this and telling you where you've forgotten this. So that, you know, the kind of automatic testing support for this sort of thing is very good. But despite that, you know, just about every site you go to, you'll see examples where that hasn't been done correctly. So some of the examples that I didn't mention, but I have seen people do the for ID association and associating with the div that wraps the input field, and that's not the way. It has to actually point, of course, to the actual element. Okay. Then the next scenario is multiple labels. Now, there's two cases that you have here. The one is where you've got a group of elements that all belong together. An example of this might be your address, or it might be social security number, where the social security number is broken up into 3 fields, and you need the label for social security number for all of those fields. The preferred way of doing it, if it's that first case, is with a field set and a legend. And then what will happen is the screen reader goes into those, depending on which screen reader it is, it'll read out social security number, and then it'll read out, in this case I've marked this up with the title attribute because that social security number label counts as the visual label for all the fields. So I'm adding additional label to that, which is first 3 digits, second 2 digits, last 4 digits, or middle 2 digits, last 4 digits. So it'll read out, as the user goes into that, it'll read out social security number, first 3 digits, and then they tab to the next one, it'll read out the appropriate thing. Screen readers deal slightly differently with this depending on which screen reader, but the support for it is very broad and good, so I would recommend using this first. And then if you come in from the back as well, you know, obviously if you're coming backwards, you needed to read the same stuff out as well. So that example does that. So then, obviously there's also, you could probably guess at this if you haven't already, there's a way to do this with ARIA as well. The advantage of this is it gives you a little bit more control. So there's scenarios where, even though you shouldn't do this, you probably would want to use it. If you're using tables for layout, which you shouldn't do, but a lot of people have to, either because your framework dictates that or something, so you have to live within that framework, then you cannot wrap a field set around multiple table cells. And so in that scenario, you have to use ARIA label by. The other scenario which is useful, if you don't like the fact that it reads out that group label on every single element, then you can control that more fine-grained manner by using ARIA label by. In particular, if you have a large number of those input elements, you may want it to read out that group label when it comes into the first element from the top, or if you're going tabbing backwards in the first element from the bottom, but then no longer read it out as you go through the rest of that group. And you can control that with ARIA label by in this way, by putting some kind of element around your group label. In this case, I've got gender, and then you've got, for the first element at the top, you've got ARIA labeled by, and I'm pointing to the gender group ID, and I'm also pointing to my male gender label there. And the same thing for the female gender. And then if there were some other ones in between, like other or whatever, you could then just put their own label and leave the group label out, which is, in fact, my examples. Can I show you that?
Hey Dylan,
Yeah.
can you turn down the rate of speech for some of the folks that don't do this every day? You're mortal.
Well, can you guys read? Well, no, I suppose. Can you guys read it? Is that good enough? I mean, the screen reader users that are in the room probably can hear it, right? Am I right?
Yeah.
Does
You
that-
make the caption.
If you turn down the rate and turn up the volume, it'll make it easier for the back row to hear it too.
Let's see. Doesn't work.
Your pitch is very high too, Devin.
I know, but it's going to take me.
Alex is freaking me out right now.
Sorry about that. How about I turn the sound off? I'm not joking, because then we can see what it says over there, right? That's actually the way I use it when I'm in a room where other people are and I don't have headphones, and I'll turn the sound off and just read the text. But that's maybe not so fair for the people in the room who can't see. So let me turn it back on. Sorry, so I said last name, edit text. I'll read it out for you guys if you can't hear it. So that as I go into the gender, it says gender, male, radio button, 1 of 3. Now you'll notice it didn't read out selected because it's not selected. Then if I tab past the group and I come from the bottom, it reads out gender, female, radio button, 3 of 3. But as I select then the in-between item, which is other, it just reads other selected radio button 2 of 3. So that's an example of where you can control that, and you get exactly the same experience for all users on all the 80s because you've told the screen reader exactly what you wanted to read out. All right, so then what you'll often have in forms is you'll have additional advisory text in the form to give the user additional instructions. A good example of this is Twitter, where you have the number of characters that you're allowed to type in. It's not strictly a label, it's more like a hint, or you may have a date format, month, day, why, whatever it might be. So generally what that is additional information, not necessarily essential for the user to hear every time, and that's what I call that a hint. VoiceOver refers to that as a hint. Advisory text is how I like to refer to that. And the way you can do that is with another ARIA attribute called ARIA describe by. And so what you have is this label date of birth, which is using for ID association to point to the input field. And then the input field points to another element using its ID, saying that element also describes me. And then the screen reader reads it out in a very particular order. It'll read the label first, and it varies a little bit by screen reader, but it'll read the label first, the type of input element, the value of it, and then the hint text afterwards. So that's very useful where you've got additional text, in particular if it's positionally separated from where that input field is as well. So in this case, you see the date of birth and I knew there's a reason that I kept. Okay. I knew there was a reason I was interrupting the slideshow because with 2 screens and words are really irritating. Anyway, so let me do that again. I'm going to shift tab. Oops. Not command tab, shift tab over. And then I'm going to come back into the date of birth field. So you see it read date of birth, edit, text, and then it read out mmdd/YYYY. And that's now in VoiceOver, in order to get it to do that fast, you have to actually change the default settings because by default it waits 10 seconds before it reads the hint text. And there's some other irritating stuff that it reads first, but if you go in your voiceover preferences and just slide all the way to the left, it'll actually read it out like JAWS and NVDA do, which is immediately after it's read out the input element itself. So that's very useful. You'll see a lot of that getting used. It's getting used more and more by real sites out on the web there to give instructions for more complex forms. Alright, so that stuff is relatively straightforward as well. Also relatively easy to implement, but it brings a lot of value to screen reader users. The ARIA describe my thing was not really possible to do before ARIA came along. You really were forced to put everything into the label field, and that's one of the areas where ARIA has really made a huge difference. The other one is in ARIA Live, which we'll get into a little bit later. So what about from a layout perspective? So some of the things that you need to take into account when you're thinking about your forms is to make sure that the labels are closely related to the input fields. And this has to do with, in particular, zoom text users, because a zoom text user, when they zoom in to the screen, they can see, basically about a quarter-sized piece of the screen at any given point in time. So if they have to navigate across, in this, for example, in this form over here, where the form fields are all the form labels are all left justified and the form fields are all right justified, and there's this, star in between, which I suppose is to indicate a required field. Then, as a zoom text user is zooming in, and they come and read this label over here or this label over here, they may actually end up at the wrong field. And so they may get confused when they're navigating a form like this because of the distance between the label and the input element. Now, screen reader users often, zoom text users or zoom users often use a screen reader and the zoom if their eyesight is very bad, but not all of them do. So you do need to take into account the fact that there's you either put a zebra striping over here to make sure that it's easier to associate these labels with the input fields, or, well, let me just show you what it looks like to a zoom text user. That's like a little snippet of what they might see as they're navigating that. I prefer, for multiple reasons, I prefer to recommend putting the label above the input field. The reason for that is because that, when it's zoomed in, as we can see on the next slide, really, even at a very high zoom level, it's easy for the user to associate the label with that input field. But also, on a mobile device, that'll also look pretty nice on a mobile device. So you don't have to, it's easier in a responsive web page to have something that looks relatively similar both in your mobile device and in your desktop browser as well. And that's an example of what that can be made to look like, let's say, those same form fields if you're on a mobile device using some media query stuff. All right, let's go back a little bit because there are a couple of other things there. With the error messages, same thing. Just make sure the error messages are visually associated and close to the input fields, and also make sure that the instructional text, it's all really related to that zoom text user. Make sure that it's easy for them to actually make that association so that they don't make mistakes as they're going through the layout of the form. Then make sure you maintain that natural DOM order. This has to do with, if somebody's coming through a field and they're tabbing through it, going from field to field. That's a very natural way for a screen reader user or a keyboard-only user in particular to go through a field. Some screen reader users will turn will turn off the form navigation mode and go through the entire form field, the form first in DOM navigation mode, but some of them won't. So you really need to take into account the different ways that people interact with the form. And if they're just going through from form field to form field, and you haven't paid attention to the order in which those appear in the HTML document and made sure that that matches the visual order, then they could get confused by the form at first, and you're basically forcing them into that some other mode of trying to determine what's going on with that form. And also, just because you have JavaScript doesn't mean that you always have to use it. And what you'll sometimes see is some, I want to call it misguided, is maybe a bit too strong a word, but people are using JavaScript for managing focus in forms where it's really not necessary. So what I like to recommend is that you just leave the form in the natural DOM order that looks like the way the form is laid out to a sighted user, and don't do anything else. Don't use tab indexes, because even though you may get them right, they're pretty prone to error, and I'll show you an example of that right now. Right, so here you have a form, looks pretty good, and I as a developer, I was told by whoever's in charge of the business side of this, I want to make sure that people can get into this form very quickly, and so I don't want them to have to tab through this form. So you decided to yourself, okay, I'm going to go and put tab indexes on this, and let me just show you the code quickly. So you went through this and you said, okay, I'll use tab index, and I'll put tab index equals, is this the right one? 6. Where's my tab index?
7 has tab index.
Sorry?
Example 7 has the tab index.
Oh yeah, you're right. I've got my thing messed up. This is the wrong one. Yeah, sorry. Wrong page. Next page. Yeah. So you went through it and you put in tab indexes. So you've got tab index equals 1 for the first input field, tab index equals 2 for the second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on. And then at some point, somebody else came along and modified this and changed, what used to be an input type equals image, and they changed it to a button, and they forgot to put the tab index on their button. So now you've got the button without the tab index. And then a little bit later on, somebody else came and said, well, it'd be useful if we added some help to this for the social security number, because people seem to have trouble with that. So they added an anchor tag there with, points to some help. Maybe it's a dynamic help pop-up of some sort, but it also doesn't have a tab index. So now what you have is a pretty bad user experience. So as I tab through and I go into the first name field, that's great. I can enter my name. Typing with one hand is kind of difficult. And then I get to my last name, it's Barrell, I'll enter that. And I get to the social security number, and now I'm confused about this, like a lot of people are. And I want to go to the help, so I'm a sighted keyboard user, and I try to get to the help icon, link, and I can't get there because it doesn't have a tab index. So now what I have to do is I have to tab through the entire document and go all the way back to the top, and then all the way through the rest of the header and the navigation that's at the top of the document, and then I can get to the help. Hopefully, by the time I get to the top of the document, there's a skip navigation link there, and that'll get me there a little bit quicker, but if there isn't, then I can get through everything, and I come to the help. All right, and I can look at the help, and okay, now I want to go back and fill out my social security number. Sorry about that. And now I have to do the whole thing over again. So what you've done is you've created a worse experience with this by trying to be clever. You've created an experience which is really, really bad. And I've seen this in the wild, examples where every single field had a help link next to it, and it was a long form. And in order to actually use those help links with the keyboard, it was impossible. So just don't do that. And then another example is social security number. So what a lot of people think is a good idea here is, well, why don't we get it to auto-advance from one field to the next? So I started entering my social security number, and I've got some fat fingers, and I enter 2 instead of 1, and I've hit the delete key. I'm already in the other field. I'm a little confused about where I am. Okay, I figured it out, and I have to go back. Shift tab. Now the whole thing is highlighted, so I have to get to the end of the field, but it's actually the middle one. Now, hopefully I didn't make a mistake again. So you've turned something like that into a painful experience, especially for something like Jared's colleague who has to use a stick that he holds in his mouth to actually fill out that form, you've made it worse for them. This is a really good idea if you're dealing with an application that's an internal application to your organization, where people have to do data entry all the time. They know the thing very well. They're very good at typing, so they're not going to make too many mistakes. This is a great idea. But for your general website application, avoid this because it's confusing. Okay, so then dynamic forms. So there's a lot of different things that sometimes have to, that people want to do to make the forms dynamic. Things like showing additional fields that are dependent on one another, that sort of thing. So depending on what the user's entered. And there's 4 different types of events, and I'm going to deal with the first 2 now, and then the other 2 come a little later, that are often used to do this. The first combination of events is the unfocus or the focus and the blur event. And this is sometimes used to show additional instructions. So when you come into the field, now show something like a tooltip or some additional help text about what I'm supposed to do in that. And you can do that. So I'm not saying don't do any of this, because sometimes it's very necessary, and it makes a large form a lot easier to use if you can reduce it down to things that are common to every user, and then some things which vary by your different use cases. So I'm not saying don't do this, just be aware that if you want to do this, there are ways that you have to do it that make it accessible. So in the case of showing additional instructions, if you update, for example, insert a new element into the page, when focus goes onto the field, and that element wasn't there when it received focus, even if it's related using ARIA describe by, it won't get read out by all the screen readers. There are some that will, but there are some that won't. So what you need to do in this case is you need to use ARIA Live and the related roles in order to make sure that those instructions that appear on focus actually get announced to screen reader users. Then sometimes people will do field validation on blur. So as the user leaves the field, make sure that field's value is correct. The problem with that is that, if you go back to what I talked about earlier about the error messages, if the error messages have been associated inside the label, using label by or label with 4-ID association, or using ARIA describe by, the problem is that you're now in another field because you've just blurred, right? So now you have to do something to make sure that the user is aware of that. There are ways that you can do that. One of them is to, if you're doing validation like that, to pop up a dialog which says I'm doing something, and then when the user, if there's an error, you put them back in that field. Just be sure not to create a keyboard trap though, so that if the user is not sure and has to go somewhere else to find something, that they don't get trapped and they cannot get out of that field. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. The other way, which is probably a better way to do it, is to use ARIA Live to announce the errors, so that the user knows, oh, I left that field, but that field has an error, so I have to go back to it. And you're giving them control. They still have control about where they are. They don't get confused, but you've made them aware of the error that's been detected dynamically. And then sometimes you need to add fields, whether they're dependent fields. The fields might be there, but they might be empty until you choose something. So if you're choosing, insurance, you might choose the maker of your car first, and then Honda or BMW or Toyota, whatever, and then you choose the model. And you can only fill in the models once you know the make. So very valid use case. Otherwise, you'd have these select boxes which are huge, which is also an accessibility issue. So in this case, I would recommend trapping the focus in a busy modal and then putting the focus on the element that you need to. In particular, if you're adding fields into the form, because as you see in my example, a screen reader user, if you're doing this on blur, the focus is going to go to the next field, and if you've inserted some fields in there, the screen reader user won't be aware of that. And so you need to manage that focus actively. Same thing with change and input. Don't auto-advance. We saw an example of that with the social security number. Try to stay away from that sort of behavior. And if you have to, based on a change, because the change is just as valid as blur. So it's almost equivalent if you're doing dynamic validation, or if you're doing dynamic modification of the form and inserting or deleting or changing fields. you could use the change event rather than the blur event. And so once again, if you're doing that, use the modal trapping technique, and then just be aware that, as I said before, that updates to labels and ARIA described by fields aren't read out. Even if your focus stays in that field, if you update the ARIA described by or the label, it won't get read out. You have to actually do something to tell the user, the screen reader user in particular, that change has occurred. So let me show you some bad examples first, and then how to do them well. Okay, so let's just stop this, stop. So what you'll notice is the first thing I'm doing here is I'm simulating some form-wide instructions. In this case, they have no instructions for that particular field, but there could be form-wide instructions where when my focus goes into the first name field, it displays at the top there some instructions for what I'm going to do. In this case, it's saying, enter your first name as it appears on your driver's license. Now, as you heard, if you're listening with a screen reader, we could see that, but the screen reader user was not aware of those instructions being there. So that's an example of kind of form-wide instructions or additional instructions that are being inserted based on focus event. And then on the blur event, they disappear, and when I go into the last name field, the same thing occurs again. Once again, the screen reader user just hears last name edit text and doesn't hear anything about those form-wide instructions at the top. Alright, so then the next one that I want to show you is social security number. So I start typing, and I type a letter instead of a number. And as you can see, those of you who can see, so it says social security numbers cannot contain non-numeric characters. Now if I tab forward, and I tab backwards, you'll notice that it's correctly associated. So it's technically compliant in terms of the static markup. But because when I came back into the field, the screen reader read that out. So the ARIA described by relationship is correct. The problem is that I'm dynamically updating the content in that described by field so that it's not being read out to the user. So that's an example of where the dynamic updating is not happening correctly. So now I'm going to enter date of birth, and this is obviously not for me, because it's somebody who's 1 year old or whatever. And as I tab forward, you'll notice that what I'm simulating here is I'm simulating an AJAX event. It's going off to the server, and it's coming back and it's deciding that based on that input, I need to show some additional form fields. And as you could hear, the screen reader user is not aware that between the social security number and date of birth, there's now 2 additional fields, right? So they might go through the entire form, and they get to the bottom and they submit, and it says error. These are required fields. You didn't fill them out. They get confused about them. They have to go and search for all the changes that occurred in that form. Very frustrating. In particular for people with motor disabilities, it can lead to a lot of problems with large forms. So how do you do this properly, or at least one variant of properly? So this is the exact same form. The only difference I made some small changes to the actual validation, so it works a little bit better. And also I've added things to each of these. So for this one, first name field, what I'm doing is using ARIA Live to announce that. When Joseph talked about ARIA Live, he talked about it at kind of an abstract spec level. There's actually a lot of complexities to getting it to work in all the browsers and all the AT combinations. So what you actually have to do to get this to work everywhere is you have to make sure that your ARIA Live region is inserted into the document or in the document very close to kind of immediately after the ready event fires. If that's not the case, it won't work in VoiceOver, for example. So that's one thing you have to do. The second thing you have to do is you have to put one of the ARIA Live roles on it. Role equals log, role equals status, role equals alert, because without that it won't work in certain other browser and AT combinations. And then finally, you also need the ARIA Live attribute itself, And then you need the ARIA relevant attribute as well. If all those conditions hold, it'll actually work everywhere pretty well. So what I'm doing is, when the document loads, it has that live region in it, and then as I put the focus in the first name and last name field, I'm updating that content. That live region is also positioned off screen, so you can't see it, but the screen reader still picks up the changes to that live region as they occur. So if I tab forward into last name, the same thing. Now I can see, I can perceive as it is, can perceive the fact that that message appeared in the top there. Now when I go to the date of birth, and I enter my fictitious child's date of birth, and I tab forward, you'll notice it says updating, please wait dialogue, and that's because the dialogue appeared. Now I wouldn't recommend putting it down the bottom left over here. It's just a lot easier for me to program that than trying to figure out a nice place to put it on the screen. But the focus went into that dialog box, and then when after the Ajax event, the callback had come from that and the screen had been updated, based on what had happened, it determined that the focus needs to go into that Guardian field. So instead of the focus going to Social Security number, it went to the first name field. And if you do this correctly, then if you tab backwards, it'll update the form, but it'll still let the user go backwards. So you haven't created a keyboard trap. So this is the correct way to do it, without creating the keyboard trap, so that the user can go backwards and forwards regardless of what's happening. And the same thing counts for if you're deleting elements out of the form, same thing. What would have happened, I should have showed you this on the other bad example, but what would have happened if I hadn't have managed the focus there, is the focus would have gone into one of those Guardian fields, and then they would have been hidden. And now, the next time I press tab, the tab focus would have gone to the top of the document. So you've created a really bad keyboard experience if you don't even if you're just removing fields, if you don't manage that focus properly, you can lose focus in the form by hiding the element that actually got the focus naturally. So make sure that you use a technique. It's not the only way to do it. I find this way works well, but there's more than one way to skin that cat. Then finally, for the Social Security number, as I enter and I make a mistake, there's dynamic form validation as I'm entering. It picked that up. It inserted that text into the same field with the ARIA described by. So now if I tab forward, in every single one of those input fields, I'm now aware that one of them has an error. So that describe by is there always, telling me that something's wrong. I could have made it dependent on the individual field, but I decided not to. But it also read that out as it occurred, as the error occurred. So I was made aware, and that's using ARIA Live once again. So the same technique I talked about earlier. It's not only inserting it into the DOM, but it's also actually inserting that error message in two places in the DOM. One in the ARIA Live region and one in the describe by field. I'm not going to show you the code. The code's kind of complex, so you can go download it and look at it yourself and do better things than I've done with it. Okay. Animations. Don't do them. No, I'm only half joking. I really don't do them because they make things really complicated. In particular with if you're animating the insertion of things into the form. Now what you have to do is you have to make sure that when you're managing the focus, not only to do your Ajax event fire and come back, but that the resulting animation that happens after that Ajax event comes back, now you have to make sure that those elements are actually in the DOM, visible, in order for your focus to be managed correctly. It can be done. You can set timeouts. The code looks ugly. It can be done, but I would recommend that you try not to use animation, because animation with focus and ARIA Live and ARIA described by is a pain in the you know what. And so basically the form fields, as it's stated up there, have to be there. The other thing you need to be aware of that iOS right now has a pretty big bug in its focus management. Anytime you insert something new into the document or show something that was hidden using display none, you have to set a timeout that waits a full second before you can set focus onto that element. If you set less than a second, then depending on how much less, you've got a kind of probability of the focus going to the right place. And if you set it to like 100 milliseconds, it'll go somewhere between where it was and where it needs to go. It's kind of fun to play with. Yeah, so what I do is, and in the library that's referenced by the valid library, I have a utility you can use to do this. So it'll look for the user agent and it'll set the focus the appropriate way. If it's not an iOS machine, it'll set it immediately, and otherwise it'll do that 1 second wait for you. So just be aware of that. Controls. So I wasn't joking when I said to Joseph that he should just use a checkbox, because, well, he said it himself afterwards, try to use the native controls wherever you can. So use button or input type equals there's more than that, those two, but those are the most common two. Rather than trying to use an anchor tag, in particular an anchor tag like it is there without an href, because as soon as you do that, you introduce all sorts of problems. If there's no href, you have to do stuff to get focus onto it. Now you also have to make sure that you add all keyboard handling that's there naturally with all the natural button elements. It's just not worth it. So use the native controls wherever you can. There are some places like, Paul and I were just talking about something that he's going to show you with jQuery Mobile. If you have a checkbox element and it needs to look like one of those buttons that swipes back and forth on the iOS, yeah, that's maybe a good time to use ARIA markup. But then there's a really good reason, because you cannot style radio buttons and
There's no native switch control.
Right, yeah, exactly. Right, so you have to use ARIA in those scenarios. But avoid what I call the retrofit roles, because they're really just bad habit supporters for people who are used to doing things the wrong way and using anchor tags for everything instead of buttons and input elements. So I'm not saying don't ever use them, because there are good, like with everything, this is the rule of thumb, but there are good reasons to break that rule of thumb. But just be aware, every time you try that, you do something like this, ask yourself, is this really necessary? Use standard radio buttons, standard checkboxes, standard drop-downs. I would say almost never use role equals text box. I can't think of a good reason to do that almost ever. And then for the new HTML5 types, the future looks great, but the present looks kind of terrible, as Hans was pointing out. There's very sketchy support for actually adding the controls, first of all, and then the controls themselves, even in those browsers that have good support for them, like Chrome, they're not accessible. So what I think is a good rule of thumb is sniff for your user agent, and if you're on something like iOS where there's good accessible support for that, use the native HTML5 stuff. Otherwise, stick to the HTML4 stuff, at least for the next year or so. Maybe we'll be able to start using them more broadly before that, but I definitely wouldn't recommend it right now. I'm just going to show you an example of what Chrome does with the date picker. So let me interact with this before I turn VoiceOver on. So this is what this is number 10. Let me show you the source code. So this is input type equals date, and it's got a describe by, so it's nicely marked up. If you come into Chrome, it shows you the format automatically. So you could actually conditionally, you could get rid of that other format. You don't really need it anymore in Chrome. But now, as a mouse user, this is a nice UI, because now I can go here, I can go forward and backward in the month. I can say, okay, what is the first Tuesday in November? That happens to be November the 4th. Okay, let me choose November the 4th, because I want the first Tuesday in November. Great, that's a great UI. If I'm a keyboard user, I can say, okay, hit Option and arrow key down, and it opens up that control. Oh, that's great. And when I use my arrow keys, I can move around, and once again, I can choose the first Tuesday in November. That's November the 4th, and it updates that. But if I turn on the screen reader, you'll notice that I'm using all those techniques I know to try to get to that button. I can't. So then I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut. And it opens it up, but you'll notice the focus has not gone into that. Well, that's not so bad. Let me see if it announces things using ARIA Live or something like that. No, it doesn't. So it's very, now I have to go and look at a calendar somewhere else to figure out what the first Tuesday in November is, and I can then come in and not using this, but using just normal day picker kind of functionality. I can then choose the 4th of November. So much less usable than it should be or than it could be. So in the future, once they make this accessible, it's going to be great. But right now, you're really disadvantaging certain users with certain disabilities by using these input types.
Is that vertical stepper stuff that's going on there something that you added or that?
No, that's standard Chrome. Yeah.
So that is somewhat accessible to you.
Yeah, you can use it. You can either type it in, or you can use the vertical stepper. But once again, if you're trying to choose a particular, the first Tuesday in a particular month, or the second Wednesday, or whatever, that sort of functionality, which is very common in that's the reason the day picker was invented, right? And so the principle of accessibility is something is an accessibility violation if it impacts one disability group disproportionately. So there's a kind of a gray region between usability and accessibility. But for me, this is clearly an accessibility problem because a particular disability group, blind users, are disadvantaged disproportionately by this. So stay away from this is my recommendation.
Wouldn't you say that future detection would be better than?
You can't detect this now. You can't detect this now. I don't know of a way to detect this.
You can detect date picker support.
Not accessibility support.
Right, exactly.
Well, how would you detect date picker support? But using Modernizer? Yeah, but they're basically using user agent for that. They're not detecting it in the JavaScript sense of the word. There's no JavaScript functions you can say, does this function exist or doesn't. You have to actually look at the user agent string. But yeah, you could use Modernizer to figure out what support there is. And yeah, absolutely you could. But once again, you're going to have to build into, because Modernizer doesn't say this is accessible, you would have to write your own Modernizer equivalent that knows about the accessibility support of all the different browsers. And so, yeah, you could do, hey, well, that's a good jQuery enhancement, right? That'd be cool.
Even better, we just need to put pressure on browsers to make these native things accessible. So we don't have to worry.
Put in bug reports.
How am I doing on time?
Getting close. I'm just going to set up something like a hot.
Okay. So then, from a validation perspective, this is the last 3 slides, so I'm going a little bit long. Be consistent. So one of the most important things is to be consistent. So there's a couple of choices you have to make. Are you going to do automatic validation every time somebody types or leaves a field? If you are going to do that, do it on every single field, because there's nothing more irritating than a user going in, typing in some stuff, they get errors, they say, oh, okay, that's cool, now I'm going to find out every time I type something whether it's good, and then they get to the bottom of the form, press submit, and now there's more errors. Right? That's irritating. So, and it's also, can be confusing to certain types of users. So either use automatic validation or submission validation, but don't mix the two. Then the other choice you have to make is to choose whether you're going to say which fields are required or which fields are optional, and do it consistently. I recommend, because ARIA and HTML5 only have the ability to tell the user of the screen reader which fields are required, I recommend doing the same for the sighted users because it's just a lot easier. For the form validation, you kind of have to use the required attribute or the ARIA required attribute. So just do the same. But there are legitimate times where you might want to flip it and say everything's required here except for this one field. And in that case, you still have to use the same ARIA markup, etc. But there's going to be a difference. Your sighted users seeing what your non-sighted users hear. Then consistent layout and visual design. Once again, if an error looks like something once, it should look like the same the second time. You shouldn't have different markup for different types of errors. It can be very confusing to people. Once they learn an error and then they see something else, they have to go figure out what is this new thing. So consistent visual layout. That's easy actually, relatively. But also be aware that the markup impacts the usability from a screen reader perspective, an AT user's perspective. So if you're using buttons everywhere, then don't all of a sudden use anchor with roll equals button once, because it's going to be confusing for a voice recognition user that this one thing that looks like a button doesn't behave the same as the others. So the same thing for screen readers. You know, if you use field sets and legends, then try to use them everywhere and not ARIA labeled by the one time and field set and legend the other time. So be consistent with your markup, because assistive technology users can actually detect that sort of stuff, and you're just making it more difficult. I mean, the way to think about this, the way that I think about it, is pay as much attention to your markup as you do your visual design. That's the rule of thumb, because it impacts usability. And if you spend a lot of time thinking about design and thinking about usability, then you should be thinking about what markup you use, because it is usability. Ensure that error messages are visually distinct. I shouldn't have to guess at whether or not something's an error message when validation occurs. And ensure that the error messages are visually associated with the input fields. Once again, we've seen the ZoomText users, cognitive disability is also an issue. Ensure that you draw attention to the errors. If you've got a big long form, it shouldn't take me half an hour to find the one field that has an error, so draw attention to it. If you're doing a validation on submission, then put the focus into the first field that has an error, or the last one, so just be relatively consistent. Or if you've decided that your summary is where you want that to go, then put focus on the error summary if there's more than one error. But do a kind of consistent thing. If you're doing it automatically, then do something with either ARIA Live or the focus management in some way in a consistent fashion. If you have large forms and a user's made, like say you've got a 30 field form, which you probably stay away from, but if you have to, and there's one field that has an error, or two fields, one at the top, one at the bottom, as a screen reader or a keyboard user, I shouldn't have to go through the same form, because every single field in that form to find those two fields that are in error. Because a mouse user can see, a sighted mouse user can see immediately, because you've paid attention to the first bullet up there, immediately which fields are in error. So they can click their mouse on the first one, scroll down with a little scroll wheel thingy, click their mouse on the second one, they're done. But now a screen reader user or a keyboard user has to go through everything at once. So give them an easy way, keyboard navigation way, to get from an error field that's in error to the next field. This is an example. I think this is kind of a best practice that I have to give some credit to Derek Featherstone for. But this is doing a couple of things really well. Now, normally, it's got these skip to next error things, and there's only three. You can only see three fields here. I just wanted to make, normally you would hope that the user wouldn't have as many errors on their form. But this is just illustrating how you can make a keyboard user. Imagine that there was a big bunch of OK fields in the middle. Keyboard user can go to this and skip them to the next one very easily. They can also, a mouse user can very easily use the summary and the back button to click on the actual input field, the links in the summary to get to the input fields directly. Then also, even though we're using color here, if you noticed in my layout earlier, there was black text on a white background. The fact that we've flipped the dark and the white and the light, that the text is now light and the background is dark, means I don't need to be able to see the color red in order to know that something has happened with this form field over here. So we're using color in a way that Jared pointed out. We are using because it's useful, but we're also using another mechanism to convey that same information to people who can't see that color. And then of course we have this field is required, so we're adding the actual error messages. This error message gives us a little bit more information, which is useful. Must enter a valid date. So this form is doing a lot of things really well. And then as a zoomed-in ZoomText user, once again, I'm not recommending you use that style. I actually just chose that style because it makes the point, You might want to choose a slightly more subtle style. But as a ZoomText user, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that there's something going on with this field that I have to do something with. So I think that's a really good way of doing things. Then ensure, from a structural point of view, ensure the error message is associated programmatically. We've seen the techniques that you can use, ARIA described by, ARIA labeled by. Ensure that form-wide error information either receives focus or is announced automatically. Now this is something where, the example I showed you is kind of a belt and suspenders example. In that example, because it's actually setting focus automatically to the first field error, and there's an easy way for a keyboard user to get from error field to error field. You don't need to set the focus in the summary. The summary is more there for mouse users. So you don't have to always do that. Just be aware of have I done enough things to really make this easy to use. Ensure error messages are easy to understand, and validate all form fields at once. Seems like a really small thing, but it's not that small. I'm not going to show you the example. There is a final example which shows you that screenshot, shows you that working dynamically. You can download the code and execute that yourselves, because I think we're kind of running out of time, right? Thank you very much.
So a couple of things I'll say about this. This presentation is pure gold. If this is kind of new to you, or if you have some familiarity with form processing and error recovery, that sort of thing, you could probably spend 2 months just going through his presentation and figuring out the